as we're changing asset allocation.
Yeah, the one thing I can think you might do to increase contributions might be to threaten to hold your breath till you turn blue. Maybe that might work over there. But, you know, you can think of this to some degree as a continuum of models, if you will, that are possible. So at one end of the continuum, we have the current statutory situation of a 19% and change that's not going to change, and that puts you into insolvency at around 20 years or 30 years. At the other end, we have full actuarial funding, in which the contribution varies with the need, varies with the return, and is pretty much guaranteed to keep you out of insolvency. Now, in between, we have a lot of other models, some of which were discussed in SCR 105. I mean, you could like increase the 19 to 25 or something, and there's lots of things you could do. Now, I don't know which other ones we would look at. I understand your point that maybe you just want to make a decision based on the statutory model. But there is something to be learned if, when you look at the actuarial model and the statutory model, and based on a weighting of decision or weighting of factors that you like, they come up with the same allocation. And Neil's going to show you that, in fact, that happens a fair amount of the time. So at least then it's a matter of testing the sensitivity of the asset allocation to movement along this range of models. And if the models are, and if it's comparatively insensitive based on your weighting, then that tells you that your investment philosophy and policy is largely independent of what the legislature does.
If that's the case.
If that's the case.
And I'm not, and I know having seen a preview of the numbers, I know what Neil's going to show us, but I think there's also a separate question, which we'll get into when we get there, as to at what point are we measuring results? Because
right.
We're measuring results mostly at the 10-year point in time, and they get magnified a lot when we go out beyond 10 years. So I totally agree that there's not that much sensitivity if we look at results in 10 years, but there's a lot more sensitivity if we look at results further out. And so we'll wait till we get there. But I just wanted to make that point because I think there's an assumption which is a perfectly reasonable one. If we believed that the legislature every year was going to take action to reconfigure the contribution rate for actuarial purposes, and I don't think there's any reason to think they will. I think we're hoping they're going to take action, and then it may be many years before they take action again. So, I mean, I think it's a very I can see how that's the extreme to model, but I think it somewhat confuses the decision about isolating the impact of investment of asset allocation decisions. But that's just my viewpoint. So
I think there were numerous scenarios. I can't remember how many there were, at least 10, 8 to 12 scenarios, and all of us in the room doesn't know which one's going to get selected. Right. And the decision when we came up with these two scenarios was, let's take the extremes, understanding that we're probably going to fall, even optimistically somewhere in between them. But there's value in looking at the extremes.
Is that we're making asset allocation decisions, and so when we're making asset allocation decisions, we're trying to build a model that isolates the impact of asset allocation decisions. And what instead we have is we have a model now that says our funding outcome is a function of a combination of asset allocation decisions and contribution decisions, recognizing that there's that the funding levels are in the model determining how contribution rates are changing, but it just it's sort of like when you try to isolate the impact of one variable, you try to hold all the other variables constant, and I think we're not doing that, and that's all I'm saying.
You know, you're right, we're not doing that,
Okay.
yes.
And so that's just a different conceptual viewpoint as to what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to evaluate it. I'm just saying, I'm not arguing, I'm just saying it doesn't work for me.
And Paul, I think you're unequivocally right. And the challenge is that the way STRS works isn't the way most retirement systems work, because there is that self-correcting mechanism. And that is, if investments don't do well, as a matter of the way it works, contributions change. And you don't have that flexibility. And your frustration is, how do we try to solve for that when we don't have that self-correcting mechanism? I just want to.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. So, that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so given all that background and the fact that we're looking at a pretty decent wide range of portfolios, about 50,000 different portfolios within this set of constraints, we're going to introduce you to the model. And again, just going back to the, go ahead.
There's a word up here that I'm going to take a personal privilege on, and that's consensus. You may not reach consensus. You may well have disparate opinions, and there might be a simple majority that goes one way or another. There's no way to guarantee that there'll be consensus, and I just want to make that very, very clear, that that's not necessarily the result of the process.
Okay. And definitely, in fact, that will not happen today. So we're just going to go through, so here we're sort of beginning the workshop aspect, how does this thing work? And, Paul, taking your comments into account and completely understanding your comments, the key in this model is, which historically in our profession has not occurred, is our profession has not spent a lot of time on thinking about risk tolerance. It's sort of been assumed. And the consultant typically comes in the room and says, here's your efficient frontier. Oh, by the way, you sit here on that efficient frontier. This process spends a lot of time talking about risk tolerance. And the exercise is to get the investment committee to dialogue about it. And so we put together a framework that says, hey, what is your risk tolerance? And it's really, risk tolerance is a key, if not the key, component to determining what your long-term asset allocation is going to be. And that's what the model does. So what we spend a lot of time with, going back to those, number one is we try to parse the risk tolerance into these 4 decision factors and to quantify them, and brute force analyze those thresholds as much as we can. And that's pretty unique to this process, and it's the process that CalSTRS uses. It's the COP process that we've used with the state of Virginia, with the state of Kansas, with the state of Oregon, well, not with the state of Oregon, with the state of Washington, on down the line. So it's been tested through about $2 trillion worth of capital and over about 15 years of going through asset liability studies. So we do consider it a best practices approach. And so this slide here, if you can understand this slide, this is basically the framework. And Bob will probably elbow me here in about 30 seconds because he'll want to explain it because I'm not doing the greatest job. But as you can see, the first thing you see is sort of a yellow section, and you see red and green sections. Those red and green blocks are the thresholds, the quantitative thresholds that relate directly to those 4 decision factors in the same order. So on the left-hand side where you see box number 1, that was to seek to improve the relative funding path of the funding ratio of CalSTRS over a 30-year time frame relating to that original qualitative decision factor. And on down the line with the other 2. The next section, the yellow section, is basically what we're saying is each individual board member has the opportunity to emphasize one or more, from 1 to 4 of these by placing 0 to 100% on one or more of those factors. As we mentioned before, each of those 50,000 portfolios is individually is run through 1,000 scenarios to see how it performs against each one of these thresholds. So depending on how you weight them, we've already computed the ranks, and there's sort of a weighted ranking process based on the collective view of those ranks and any other ranking form you want to look at. The bottom part of the chart indicates, based on how you prioritize these and how you weight these, out pops the asset allocation that best reflects, that has the best ability of achieving the highest ranking possible based on the weighting that you arrived at. And I don't know if you have anything more to
I think
add
the
to
overall, thank you. I mean, I think the overall process notes two things that are kind of obvious when you say them. Number one, every adult decision involves pros and cons. Sometimes those pros and cons can be phrased in terms of risk and reward. But, you know, am I going to eat the corned beef on rye, or am I going to have a salad instead? You know, you're always faced with those kinds of decisions, and there's pros and cons. Our job here, our attempt here, is to help you understand some of the pros and cons that apply and to help you weight them, and that's what the voting is all about. The second thing that has not been widely recognized in either the actuarial or the investment fields is that the assets are used for something. You know, just having a lot of assets isn't necessarily a good thing. And in fact, there have even been perverse examples where funds would increase their asset level through superior investment return and at the same time would increase their liabilities due to the very self-same investment return. The state of Oregon did this about a decade or two ago. So what we're trying to do is to say, look, the assets, the effect of the assets is not just on the portfolio, it affects the state through the funded ratio and through usually actuarial contributions. So it's an attempt to extend our point of view or extend our vision to go beyond just the fund. Fair enough?
And I'd say the intent, it's not going to happen today, but the intent of this project is that we would get the individual investment committee members, in a sense, as a group, to express their priorities, their concerns on those 4 risk factors. And that hopefully will happen within the next month or two, where each individual member, and you can see your own name is in the list somewhere, you'll indicate, I think that this particular decision factor should be emphasized like this versus the others. And that's the end game for this project, is for you to put in information in here to express that.
And then importantly, to discuss those weightings with each other.
Sure. Questions. I forget, what's DF stand for?
Decision factors.
Decision factor, right, okay.
And you have 4 of them.
Right,
Okay.
I know that, but for some reason it just stands out separate from that. It's not in parentheses by a word, so I didn't know if it was maybe something else again. Possibly three, possibly 4 committee members haven't gone through this process before that aren't here today. I'm just kind of curious how far we may be going, how much of this so far will have to be repeated at the next meeting when we actually do this live. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah.
My goal today would hopefully you would see the results of a simulation. And just, even if it's extremes, here's what happens if you vote this way or that way. All the background doesn't need to be repeated. I think a description of the risks, the decision factors, and then beginning of a voting process with an introduction to how the voting process works. And I think I need to give you an anecdote to put it in context. The first time I did this with Bob was many years ago at CalSTRS. And the decision factors were to go for the highest rate of return. Another decision factor was to reduce volatility of contributions, which is not an issue that you're faced with. Okay? And literally, all of the employee members voted to get the highest rate of return, and all of the management people, in quote, the state, voted for the least contribution. And that was great because that created the vehicle to have a conversation of how do you get between those two. But literally, and people started laughing because it was so black and white. It was so clear that people were voting, in quote, their self-interest. Well, unless you put self-interest on the table, you can't have the compromises that are necessary to create a viable asset allocation. And that's the intent of the process, is to create that dialogue.
Okay. So does everybody sort of understand the intent of the framework? Okay. So what we've done, just to give you a sense of how this model, what this model might produce, we've just run a bunch of, going to Alan's point, a bunch of extreme examples. And we don't have to go into all the data for those, but we want to show you some of them to sort of give you a feel for what it means asset allocation-wise. In particular, we haven't, I don't know if we've done this before, but we're, in the asset liability studies, we do have, Bob and I have done a lot of these. There's plans where there's consolidated plans, you know, and we parse them out. But here we've run two different state support scenarios. We really haven't, is it fair to say we really haven't done that before? I mean, we've run certain state scenarios, but to look at them both stacked up against each other, we have not done that. And we want to show you, in a sense, we want to compare those. So we're, just for some preliminary findings, what we've, you know, obviously what we find is that depending on how the weights play out, the asset allocation can change a lot. So that's one key finding. The asset allocation is driven by your risk tolerance. But now the interesting thing is we've got a couple of these things with respect to what we think the state contribution scenario is going to be. Is it going to be unfavorable in a sense, i.e. the status quo, or is it going to be optimistic? We're going to get some support, some significant support from the state. What happens to the asset allocation? Well, in regard to our risk tolerance. And so we have these things here, and I'm just going to go through these real quick. If you emphasize and this makes intuitive sense, if you emphasize return-oriented decision factors, i.e. the concern about the bear market drawdown risk on the portfolio, or you're seeking solely to maximize the risk-adjusted return of the portfolio long-term, those things say nothing about the funded status or the contribution schedule for what's going to happen in the state. So they lead, regardless of the scenario that you have, those types of decision factors lead to the same result, emphasizing those under those two extreme state contribution scenarios. Interestingly enough, the pay-go factor, as we have it measured, and Mr. Rosenthal may have a different view on how to measure that, and that's okay, but state support factor, if you emphasize that factor about the concern of solvency, your assumption about state support is going to have a big impact on asset allocation. And we'll show you that. And so on this slide, this is a little bit busy. I don't know if you can see it on your computer screen very well. But again, it's the framework that we mentioned. And you can see that the frameworks are highlighted in the yellow strips. We're going through the slide. On the left-hand side, we have one scenario. On the right-hand side, we have another scenario. Left-hand side is status quo. Right-hand side is optimistic state support. You have the 4 decision factors. We got to figure out how to weight them. So we take some extreme scenarios here on weighting them, because the investment committee will never place all of their chips on 100% as a collective group. It will be spread somehow. But we just want to show the responsiveness of the model. And then you can see that we're stepping through them. We're putting 100% on decision factor 1, 100% on decision factor 2. We're stepping, it goes to 3. And then the bottom is just the equally weighted, we're going to spread our chips pretty evenly. Well, the interesting thing is the equal or non-equal signs in the middle of the page. So if you have these two state scenarios, and if you place a very heavy emphasis on funded ratio maintaining that funded ratio progress path over time, you end up getting the same asset allocation regardless of the state support scenario. If stepping down, as I mentioned, stepping down to the third and fourth, putting 100% on decision factor 3 and 4, it doesn't matter what the state scenario is. You're concerned about the portfolio itself in those two, you're concerned about short-term drawdown risk, asset deterioration in a bear market, or you're concerned about how the portfolio is going to grow. That says nothing about funding. You end up in the same place regardless of the state funding scenario. Decision factor 2 is the most interesting one in the sense that if you have a concern about solvency, state support matters a lot. And I think the reason you've got an equal sign on the bottom is because decision factor 2 is getting emphasized, and you can see that its influence is playing out there as well, just not as much. So, and if you look at the allocations, and the numbers are pretty small.
Could I make a comment?
Yeah.
The issue with regard to decision factor 2 is you're trying to avoid insolvency after some point, right? If you are in your current situation with the fixed state contribution, then what the model is telling you is that your only hope of avoiding insolvency is having a spectacular set of returns. And you're only going to get that through a very risky portfolio, and that's what it dials up for you.
Just to clarify that, which is somewhat more risky than the portfolio that you have now. Let's just frame it that way.
Mr. Rosensteel has a point.
Yes, I'm trying to understand. Let's take a look at number 3. So the goal is seek to maximize the 10-year geometric risk-adjusted annual return. So,
20.
okay, but 10 years
I'm
was
sorry,
in our
yeah,
package.
it's-
I'm sorry, I'm reading what was in
You're
the
reading-
agenda package.
yes, yeah.
Right. Okay. So 20-year. So, are you choosing? Are you optimizing for the highest median return of all your simulations, the highest average return of all your simulations? In other words, simulations doesn't give us one answer. Simulations gives us a distribution of results. So, given that there's a distribution of results, and one of the reasons to have simulation is you have a distribution of results, so you can see the risk and the variability. When you're optimizing for this particular goal, how are you measuring the maximum geometric return?
What we're doing, maximizing the geometric return, what we do is over the period of time, which is 20 years, for each trial, we compute the geometric average, the compound average return over that period of time. So that gives us a number for each trial, a compound 20-year return. And then that is a distribution across all the trials, and we measure the mean and standard deviation of that distribution.
But the asset allocation you're choosing then is the one that gives you, out of all of your simulations, 1,000 simulations or whatever, gives you the highest average return. And then you're reporting as well what that return is, as well as what the standard deviation of that return is.
The reporting is different. The selection is based on 20 years. Okay? The reporting, we measure, just as a matter of course, regardless of the decision factors, the distribution of returns and the distribution of cost and funding at 10 years.
That's a separate question, then we'll get to
Okay.
that, but what I'm trying to understand is your selection of the maximization point is that you take all different possible asset allocation distributions. And for each, and then you optimize for the one that, given 1,000 simulations for that distribution, gives us the highest average of those 1,000 different scenarios.
Yes.
Okay, so in other words, when you're optimizing, all you're looking at is what optimizes the average of the 1,000 simulations. You're not looking at, you're not, in choosing that, you're not looking at the what the distribution of the 1,000 results
The
generate.
geometric return itself contains an adjustment for risk.
Well, I know that, but what I'm saying is,
So
let's
it does
just,
take
let's
into
just,
account,
let's
it
just,
does
let
take-
let me, I understand that, but I'm trying to understand what you're optimizing for, because it's not clear to me. Let's just say we only have 3 possible asset allocation possibilities, okay? We have an infinite number, but let's just say we have only 3. So you run each of the 3 1,000 different times through your simulation model.
Please pardon the interruption. Your conference.
Bummer.
Okay.
So you run 1,000 simulations with asset allocation 1, asset allocation 2, asset allocation 3. Then you take the average of, for each of those 3, you take the average of the 1,000 results.
Geometric return
Right,
results.
geometric return results. And the one that's got the highest average geometric return is our optimum decision, is our optimum asset allocation, right?
Yes, for
Okay.
just that decision factor.
Right, for just that decision factor. But then in choosing that, in coming to the conclusion that that's the best, it doesn't tell us anything about anything other than the average. It doesn't tell us that one might have the average, the highest average, but the chances that it's going to be 5 percentage points less than that is very large, whereas another one might have a slightly lower average, but the chance that it's going to be very different from that average is very minuscule.
Yes, and in fact, we have used decision factors that have both the average return and the standard deviation of that.
But that's not what we're doing. Okay, I just want to understand because my concern is not what the average is. The average, the average is the average isn't what we're worried about. What we're worried about is the outliers.
Yeah, and in
Yeah,
fact,
you have a decision factor that reflects that outlier in decision factor 4.
yeah, that's your proxy for return risk, is the drawdown.
Okay.
What you're doing, talking about it out loud, is exactly what the process is designed to do. If you thought about those things simplistically, red are stop signs and green's the gas pedal. And what you're doing is you're driving the car and you're changing the speed and you're moving between lanes and you're hitting the brake and you're hitting the gas. And making those pure, and that is you don't hit the gas and the brakes at the same time. Well, in fact, that's what you're going to do if you spread your votes. If you don't, you're going to put all your brakes on and just stop the car, or you're going to go really fast.
Okay.
And what gets lost sometimes is that there were constraints used in the model, because if there weren't constraints, that portfolio with the highest rate of return would be 100% private equity. But the constraints create a diversified portfolio. It mandates a diversified portfolio. So you can't get something that's truly illogical.
Okay, Paul?
Yes.
Maybe at this point, show them one of the worksheets, and
Yeah, I think that might be.
maybe that's where you.
Yeah, the remaining, so you're, well, I think what I wanted to highlight here is just that if you look at the different asset allocations, depending on how you emphasize the factors, and these are extreme weightings here, we would never expect you to weight one of these things 100, the whole group to weight one of these things 100%. They are significantly different from one another. That's one of the other points. So if you go, keeping with Mr. Rosenthal's example, if you go with 100%, let's just take the left-hand side, the status quo. If you go with seeking to maximize the 20-year geometric return, you end up with more public equity than you have now. You end up with maximizing both private equity and real estate, and you minimize your bond allocation, and you don't get anything allocated to those other two supplementary classes that are meant to diversify the portfolio. So within the constraints, as Alan mentioned, it's a very aggressive portfolio. And that's what you'd expect. That's intuitive because you're weighting that thing 100%. But if you shift gears and you just step down, and look at the next example, which has high concerns about drawdown risk, and that you want to totally avoid what happens, a dangerous outcome in the short term, you're going to get a very different asset allocation. And you can see that instead of maximizing global equities, you're practically minimizing it within the constraints. You're maximizing the fixed income allocation because that's a very stable class. And the allocation actually significantly adjusts the allocation to private assets because under the assumptions that we have, those are also viewed as being quite risky. And it doesn't allocate to both of the supplementary classes, but it maxes out on one of them because it sees the diversification potential there. So there's major differences between the asset allocations that you're going to get as expressed through the group's risk tolerance. That's one of the other points of this slide. But just to highlight, if we just go to what I'd just like to do real quickly is if we go to, it's going to be hard. The numbers are different than they are on the screen here because we revised the presentation after your packet. But if we were to roll forward to, just as one more example, to roll forward to INV 139, just to show the trade-off. Both 27 and 28 are placing 100% emphasis on a concern about significant short-term impairment to the portfolio. You can protect against that if you want. And we have analytics. We can go we'll walk through a little bit of these analytics. But the point here, and it's very hard to see, and I'm sorry for that, is that if you do that, there are trade-offs. And the one that plays out in this one is if you want to protect yourself in a big way, you're going to lose out on expected return long-term in a big way. So there's a huge opportunity cost associated with trying to protect yourself 100% against some kind of short-term bear market. And that's highlighted in the numbers here. And I guess if we brought up the spreadsheet, we could maybe see them a little bit better. But do we want to do that?
Yeah, I think that just to identify what the graphs are there, the one on the left is the efficient frontier. And one of the things, it's actually the whole cloud of portfolios. So what you have there, and it will make your printer choke, is 50,000 dots in that graph. Each of them represents the average return and the standard deviation of the return for that particular portfolio. The question in any routine or any normal asset allocation or traditional asset allocation is where along the efficient frontier do you want to be? You know that there's increased return with increased risk. This process is meant to help you answer that question for yourselves. And what we have there is the current portfolio, which is the triangle, and then the red box is the portfolio that's selected by optimizer here based on your weighting of decision factors. Now, this will be done by spreadsheet interactively when we're actually working with the board on this. But you can see that, as Neil said, given the stated in this example intense concern with drawdown risk, it pushes you to the most conservative portfolio it can find. And then the middle graph shows some measurements that are made at year 10 of the various financial outcomes for the current portfolio and for the best portfolio according to the optimizer. And then the last graph to the right shows sort of where the ranking of this portfolio is relative to the current portfolio for each decision factor. So we'll go through the analytics in more carefully and more detail, but the key thing is that you're weighting your decision factor, or you're weighting your decision factors, and that is showing you where on the efficient frontier you want to be.
And the right-hand chart is a pretty quick read. Of course, when you weight a factor 100%, you're going to get the best portfolio that solves the problem. So you can see that you have the little red marker on the right-hand line, which reflects that fourth decision factor, and that red marker represents the optimized portfolio, is at the top because it ranks the best, and you've weighted that thing 100%. But guess what? There's a trade-off associated with that. Across all the other decision factors, it ranks the worst. So again, it's a trade-off pros and cons analysis based on Bob's prior comments. And I guess we could stop there. We have a spreadsheet that has this all workable, where you could stick in any kind of weighting that you wanted to if you wanted to test it out, but we can save that for when we have more members in the room. But we're happy to answer any additional questions at this time. We just don't want to overstate.
I would like to recommend that we hold off on that, because I think we are going to have to, and then I'll give an opportunity to ask some more questions, but I think we don't want to necessarily test drive this without everyone here that's going to be actually participating. So, Paul, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do, and my understanding is that the results that are being shown, so those 6 columns in the middle, that those are all measurements as of 10 years. So the returns are after 10 years. The funding stat level and the cost is over a 10-year period of time. And I wonder whether we can look at something longer than that as well. And the reason is because I think especially the number 4, the drawdown, avoiding the drawdown, the impact of avoiding a 2-year protracted drawdown in the first 10 years is going to show up having a lot more impact beyond 10 years than it is in 10 years. That's the whole point of what Neil said, which is we care about a bear market in the next 10 years. We don't care about a severe bear market as much 25 years from now. So the point is that if we have a couple of years of really poor returns in the near term, it becomes very hard to dig our way out of it, and therefore the diversion between a situation where we avoid that and a situation where we suffer that magnifies over time. And my concern, as much as anything here, is to use this model to say the Milliman report says we run out of money in 30 years if we don't get contribution increases, but we know that that's on the assumption we get 7.5% every year. There's a risk we don't get 7.5%, and if we don't, how quickly does that accelerate the unfunding of the system, and how do we avoid having that how do we increase the chances that if it happens faster than 30 years, it happens in 25 years rather than 15 years? And so I think that looking at a 10-year horizon doesn't help us answer that question, which is the question that I want answered. And I also think that looking at the 75th median and 25th percentile is a little bit, again, we can read into it, and Neil, I appreciate the email you sent to me that explained to me how to do this. We can read into it something more, but you know, if you take a look at number 1 versus number 4, and you look at the returns, and you look at the standard deviation, which is much greater for number 1 than for number 4, we have a 1 in 6 chance under number 1 of having returns that are -7% or less.
Yeah.
Or less than -7%, right? Whereas we have a 1 in 6 chance in number 4 of having a -3 or less return.
Big difference.
Big difference. We have a 1 in 6 chance of having funding that is down at 16%.
Yeah.
In scenario 1, we have a 1 in 6 chance of having funding down at 24% or less in number 4. So, you know,
You want some, your preference is to have some downside, better description of downside risk.
Yeah, and just to make sure also that you know, as this is presented and as the committee considers it, that you know, if our concern is protecting against the downside risk, that we see that, because you're absolutely right. If we get to the median, if we get to the expected, you know, we would have been silly to have chosen, you know, weighted number 4 at all. We should have been at number 1. But the question is, what's, you know, is it a 1 in 25 risk, or is it a 1 in 5 risk, or a 1 in 3 risk that something, you know, could go seriously wrong because we choose the more aggressive. And that's I think exactly what Alan is saying, which is, you know, you have to, you can't look at the expected. You have to look at what could go, you know, what could either go right or go wrong, but different from the expected in terms of balancing out how you allocate your decision factors.
Am I just hearing that you would like to have a better display of the potential distribution outcomes than we have now?
That would be helpful. And I would also like to see something more than 10 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
plus the horizon issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we can do that. The only issue we're having generally in that is, well, we'll have to rerun our searches, which, you know, 50,000 portfolios takes a while, but the only issue we're really having is real estate on the screen in terms of display. You can see we're already squinched in real tight. So I think what we'll do for the spreadsheets is move it over to another tab, and so we can look at that. But I think we can do that. We can do those fine.
Harry, I'd like to check with you to see if you have a specific question or not. If you're there.
I don't, Terry. The 4 descriptors are pretty clear, and the comments made by Paul added to some of my thinking about it.
All right, thank you. Do you want to take a 5-minute break or continue on?
Well,
You're the
Mr.
chair,
McGuire,
Terry.
you know, if there's no more questions, we can close this part of the session down if that's your preference. And we would work with staff to come back in July or August with further information.
Do you have anything further you'd like to comment on?
No, because the goal is to get you comfortable with the model so that you can put an emphasis on the decision factors and see what the model says and then go from there.
Yes, Mr. Emkin.
To add piquancy, because I love piquancy with my Tabasco sauce. It's just important to keep in mind that reasonable people in this group could view these risks very, very differently. And that is, someone could say there's the risk of running out of money, and someone else could say there's no risk of running out of money because we have a call on the general fund. And I might agree or disagree with that point of view, but that in fact might be someone's way of looking at it. And it's just important to recognize when we look at the decision factors that the people who vote could look at them very, very differently, and that it is truly an art and not a science.
Okay. Is Chris in here?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. We look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. There's our CIO. We do have two more information items and then one panel discussion. Want to take a 5-minute break or continue?
I'm fine.
Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll try to continue. Thank you.